Okay, so today I'm interviewing somebody that's greatly contributed to the scientific research that we know about EFT and other types of energy psychology. He founded the non-profit Soul Medicine Institute, which is dedicated to research and education, and has programs such as the Iraq Stress Project, which helps veterans seeking treatment for PTSD. He's the author of many books, The Soul Medicine and The Gene in Your Genes. It's Dr. Dawson Church. Thanks for being here, Dawson. I'm really privileged to be interviewing you for my blog.
Well, you are bright and bubbly light, so I'm glad to be here.
Fantastic. Dawson, the first question I've got really is, what ignited your interest initially in psychology?
Well, what happened for me was an interesting journey. When I was 15 years old, I took my first classes in energy medicine, and we were using a technique called attunement, which is a lot like Reiki, where you hold your hands over someone's body. And we saw people have remarkable shifts, remarkable recoveries. So from an early age, I was very into this whole idea of energy medicine. And then as I grew older, I heard the refrain from psychologists, from doctors, something variants of the theme that you energy medicine people have these lovely techniques, but there's no science behind what you do. And so in the 80s, early 90s, that was true. But then, like a revolution in science, the ideas of neuroplasticity, psychoneuroimmunology, and epigenetics converged. So first of all, psychoneuroimmunology, the idea that as you think, as you feel, as you have experiences, those are actually triggering the production of neurotransmitters, of hormones like adrenaline, like cortisol, like DHEA, things like GABA, serotonin, dopamine, and so on, all being triggered not just by external events, but by thoughts, by feelings, by our whole internal consciousness, world of consciousness as well. So that was a big shift. Then scientists began to realize that our brains were not these frozen organs that we used to think of them of. In the 70s, if you look at biology textbooks, you'll see the information that the brain grows to the age of about 17, and that's it. We now know our brains are dynamic every few minutes. Like for example, even the structures in your neurons that make them give them form, like the girders in a building, and even these girders are being picked apart by the body and reassembled about every 10 minutes. So the new pictures of our brains on the boil, our brains are shifting dynamically with every thought we have, every feeling we have. We're literally creating new neural pathways in our brain. And this means if you think a negative thought over and over and over again, you create a big information channel for that negative thought. If you say negative things, if you're in the habit of being unkind or unpleasant, you literally are building that circuitry in your brain to do that more efficiently. But if you choose compassion, if you choose kindness, if you choose love, if you choose to be heart-centered, then you literally are reshaping your brain in that direction. And over the course of weeks, days, months, one remarkable piece of research found that if you pass a signal through a neural pathway repeatedly for an hour, you literally double the number of connections in that pathway. So every hour that you do something repetitively or think something repetitively, you're literally doubling the number of neural connections in your brain, rewiring your brain with every thought you have. That's why I say you can't afford the luxury of a negative thought. You need to shift that negative pattern really quickly. And so these new fields like epigenetics that show that as you have an experience, as you have a thought, as you have a belief, as you do EFT, that you literally are triggering the expression of those genes that code for hormones like cortisol, like adrenaline, like DHEA. DHEA is your main cell regeneration and youthfulness hormone. Cortisol is your main stress and aging hormone. And you can shift yourself into a state of having high cortisol and low DHEA in a few seconds by the quality of your thinking, the quality of your actions, what resides in your heart, the quality of your peace of mind. So what happened over the course of the last 20 years is we now found that science showed us that our psychology was inherently tied up with our physiology. And so I became intrigued by this whole intersection of the two, the intersection of consciousness and physiology. And so if you look at my sort of experimental career, you'll find that I gradually shift from more and more energy medicine to more and more psychology, but now more and more to physiology. What's happening under the hood? What's happening under the bonnet when we have these sorts of shifts? What happens to the level of our cells and the molecules in our body? Because they are being affected by every single thought we think, every single strong emotion we have. And these are all elements of our choice. We can choose to have either, we can start the day with meditation, fill our hearts with compassion and love, or we can start the day with thoughts of stress, anguish, and so on. And that's having a big effect on our body. So I become intrigued by what's going on there.
The next question I had that kind of runs on from that really is, so how do the other more kind of traditional techniques like sort of EMDR or CBT, which are obviously more mainstream and are used by, well, I don't know about in the States, but are used quite conventionally in the NHS and systems in the UK, how do they differ from EFT and energy psychologies in terms of that change in the neural pathways, and what makes energy psychology so much more powerful, and does it make it more powerful?
Yes. I think we need all of those therapies. I think cognitive behavioral therapy is really useful because it has people question their cognitions, the way they see the world, their worldviews, their frames. And ideas in EFT like reframing or pre-framing, they come partly from neuro-linguistic programming. They also are grounded in cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive processing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapies, all the cognitive therapies really have a lot to offer us. And we did one piece of research looking at people who were getting EFT from a regular psychotherapist, licensed mental health professional, or who got EFT from a life coach. We found that those who got EFT from a licensed mental health professional who knew cognitive behavioral therapy, who knew exposure therapy, and so on, their results were quite a bit better than from those who got it from a life coach who had coaching, training, and also EFT. So if you combine EFT with those other therapies, and for example, there are therapists who use EMDR in some cases, but EFT in others, and they're really good at reading their clients, knowing what they can tolerate. Skilled practitioners have a big toolbox and can grab whatever out of that toolbox is the most useful. There are even cases, honestly, there was somebody I had in a workshop last year, and I told her, don't do EFT. Don't do EFT for a year. Go to this other stuff, because she had no psychological resources. Normally with EFT we say, focus on the negative, focus on all the problems in your life, focus on early childhood wounds, focus on events. This woman was so psychologically fragile that she would just fall apart whenever she had such a mass of dysfunctional, toxic, old stuff that despite all the EFT in the world, she was overwhelmed by it, and she had so little resources. It was like an island. There was no island of sanity on which she could stand. So she had to make the island bigger first, then go off and start dealing with the terrible ocean of problems around her. So EFT is great for reducing psychological triggering. If you're triggered by events, by people, by situations, if you have old unhealed childhood trauma, EFT is superb. But if you have EFT and a good toolbox of other skills, you have the best of all possible worlds.
Now, some people say that EFT is nothing more than a placebo. Now, I don't agree with this for several reasons. Firstly, it's been said that children, for example, are intolerant. They don't have placebo. They don't know about placebo, up until the age of 10. Well, in my experience of using EFT, it works just as well with children as it does with adults. And secondly, nobody that ever comes to see me believes in EFT. In actual fact, they think it's the bonkiest thing ever, but they come to me because a lot of the time, because I'm dealing with chronic pain, and with sort of dancers and sports professionals, they're desperate. And it still works. So what's your view and thoughts with regard to people saying EFT is a placebo?
I have some wonderful friends, David Feinstein and Donna Eden, and they wrote the book Energy Medicine and other books as well. And one day I was in an audience. We often teach together. We often are in the same conferences, lecturing together. And one day, though, I was in one of their workshops in the audience, and David said, "Who here is a skeptic?" And I raised my hand. Because honestly, I am a skeptic, because the reason I'm a skeptic is because I get these research results in, and even though I've done the research, my left brain can't believe it. I literally have trouble, Carey. I have trouble believing people will heal this fast. I had one guy in a workshop a while back with a broken leg, and he volunteered to be a subject, and he was on crutches, had a cast on his leg. He'd been in an automobile accident about 2 weeks before, and I asked him about his pain level, and it was an 8. So my left brain is saying, this won't work. Now that's not placebo, that's nocebo. That is the person delivering the therapy doesn't believe it'll work, and the person who's getting the therapy doesn't believe it'll work. Both people don't believe it'll work. It's the opposite of placebo. It's putting a negative hex on the treatment because you're both convinced it won't work. Well, of course, that's totally wrong. Within a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes of tapping, his pain was down to a 2. Now, we didn't tap on the pain. In fact, I rarely tap on the pain. I tapped on all the emotional self-talk, like, what was happening for you emotionally when you broke your leg in the auto accident? My wife made me drive that night, and I didn't want to go. So he didn't get there. So his resentment toward his wife, which turned out to be his resentment toward his father when he was 5 years old. So we worked on that, and what we find in our research is that roughly 2/3 of pain is emotionally based. It's all that self-talk, that self-criticism. I shouldn't have been driving that night. Why did I do this again? Why did I not get the message from my body, from my life, before I had the accident? Why did it take getting an injury before I got the message? So there are all these layers of self-talk. They're compounding the pain, and we find that about 2/3 of what we think of as physical pain is really emotional pain layered on top of physical pain. When you resolve the emotional pain, there is still some physical pain. He was still at 2. He wasn't a 0 after this, but the 2 was the real, actual organic pain, and the other 6 points were all the emotional pain. So I have found that EFT works, even if I honestly don't believe it'll work. I often am in front of a big crowd of doctors or psychiatrists or biologists or physiologists or nurses, chiropractors, and suddenly I'm looking at this whole crowd of people. I'm doing a demonstration. My left brain is saying, Dawson, this will never work. You're about to embarrass yourself and disgrace the whole field of energy psychology. This will never work with this person. I just begin tapping. I let my heart be soft. I let the healing energies of the universe flood into that moment. I get my own self out of the way. And, of course, it works brilliantly every time.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I work with sort of athletes and sports professionals and dancers. I never start with the emotional stuff because I try to ease them into it a little bit. If I can clear some pain, with the basic techniques, chasing the pain and things like that,
yes.
I generally start there. And then when we get stuck, then we start moving into the emotions. And I love using metamedicine and different diagnostic tools, like Lincoln's book of Messages from the Body, and because it was really interesting to see the psychological conflicts that are associated with different parts of the body.
Yes.
And,
yes.
I mean, as you probably know, I specialise in chronic pain. Unfortunately, there's very, very little research to back up the efficacy of EFT when it comes to using it for chronic pain or injury. However, I've kind of come up with my own little theory, and I was wondering if I could quickly run it past you and get any
Sure.
feedback that you might have on it. I mean, pain experts say that the brain has its own pain relief system. This occurs when endorphins are released in the body.
Yes.
And according to researchers at Harvard Medical School, stimulating the acupressure points, amongst other things, releases these types of endorphins.
Yes.
So that's kind of the first part of the puzzle that I put together. The second part was how the brain changes when it's manipulated. And when it's manipulated, you change your perceptions. So the kind of question I've got is, do you think it's possible that the way the neurology is changing in the brain whilst tapping, because we're manipulating it, we're changing perceptions about the world and about our inside world really, coupled with the release of endorphins, increasing GABA and that kind of thing. Do you think that could be a reason why it works so well with pain?
I think that those biological changes, like shifts in endorphins, are a consequence of psychological change. And so you measure the success of psychological interventions by the molecular changes in the body. And David Feinstein and I wrote a really key paper on this for a big American Psychological Association journal called Review of General Psychology. And we argued in this paper that you actually measure the success of psychological treatments by physiological shifts in the body. So when that memory, say of a dancer, I worked with one dancer, and this was a young male dancer, and he had trouble with a kind of a kick called a grand bottomant. He said, I can't do a grand bottomant. So I actually measured him. He did 3 grand bottomants. I marked exactly how high he could go with each one. So after EFT, his kick was much, much higher. And so what's happening is that as these psychological shifts occur in therapy or with EFT, they reduce our stress, and so our body no longer goes into fight or flight, producing those hormones like adrenaline and cortisol when we had that thought. So before we had that thought, oh, I can't kick this high, or oh, I'm afraid I'll injure myself, or I remember when my dance teacher criticized me when I was 5 years old. This is all holding us back. Once we resolve that with EFT, suddenly when we have that same thought, it no longer carries an emotional charge. When there's no emotional charge, then the body isn't going into fight or flight. And when the body isn't going into fight or flight, then we no longer produce those high levels of these adverse hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, and they drop. And of course, that's exactly what we showed in the cortisol study. We gave people a session of either EFT or talk therapy or rest in the clinic, and we found that EFT lowered cortisol levels much more than either talk therapy or rest. So what I believe is happening, what David and I argue in that paper, is that when you release emotional tension, when you release the stress response, when you release the energy trapped in those old emotive experiences, then this can be measured in the body as a whole series, a whole slew of biological responses, like a drop in stress hormones, an increase in benevolent hormones like DHEA. And so it should be measurable throughout the body. And in fact, experimentally, we proposed 5 studies at the end of that paper. We've now done 1, and we're beginning the 2nd study, and they're showing exactly what we predicted. As you release psychological distress, the body just naturally heals itself.